Thank you all for coming out. My name is Samar Ali. I'm the director of the Center for Middle East North African Studies and also a professor in Near Eastern Studies. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce a friend of mine from a long time ago, Dr. David Abramson. Dr. Abramson is a senior analyst on on Russian foreign, pardon me, on Russian foreign policy in the U.S. Department of State, the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. He has worked on Central Asia for 25 years in academic and government capacities, and also worked to promote religious freedom in the department's Office of International Religious Freedom. Dr. Abramson received his PhD from Indiana University's Department of Anthropology and has published numerous articles on state and society, Islam, and gender in Central Asia. His most recent publication is a co-authored chapter with Noah Tucker entitled Engineering Islam, Uzbek State Policies of Control, in a volume called Islam, Society, and Politics in Central Asia, edited by UVM's own Pauline Jones. It's my great pleasure to introduce him and to welcome him. Thank you so much, David, for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Samar. It's great to be here, to be invited to speak today, and thank you all for coming on this rainy and Friday afternoon and being on regular time, not Michigan time. You were all patiently waiting for 10 minutes. I want to start today with a disclaimer. Since I work in the government, just to say that my views in the presentation are my own and not necessarily reflect those of the U.S. government or the State Department. And now that we have that out of the way, I wanted to talk about Central Asia between Russia and China, although I'm going to be talking about more than just that. We have this map of Central Asia here and there, just to score a provocative point. There it is between Russia and China. And as the title of this talk suggests, I will address various geostrategic issues that might sustain foreign power interest in and engagement with Central Asia. However, it's intended to be provocative as a title rather than a vote of confidence in the hackneyed great power or great game political approaches often applied to Central Asia. So a couple of questions I want to address in this talk. How do foreign policy concerns define Central Asia's global relevance? And are there other useful ways to talk about regional relevance, and relevant to whom? And this is, seems like it, a question that anyone looking at the region or any region, it's just natural to think about relevance. Relevance is especially important coming from the perspective of policy in Washington. And those of you who have had any exercises in trying to demonstrate the relevance of your own research and are being told it needs to be relevant, we still need to ask relevant to whom. And so most of my talk today will address the first question and related questions more than 25 years after the Soviet collapse. Who is influencing Central Asian states and why? What are Central Asian states' interests and how are they pursuing them? But at the end, I want to address why the focus on great power interactions with Central Asia, why there is a focus on that in the policy world, but not only there. And I also will suggest other ways to think about relevance. I'm not proposing any new theoretical frameworks, but as an analyst bridging policy and academic worlds who is familiar with political, scientific, and anthropological approaches to Central Asia and Eurasia more generally, I aim to bring a particularly, dare I say, unique perspective to discussions of relevance. So and I'm going to go back and start with a more traditional approach because I don't know how many of you are have looked at Central Asia in depth, but this will be a good background. But it's also important for those who have to sort of get a sense of the policy interests in the region and what drives interest in Washington and elsewhere, but also in the capitals of other countries dealing with Central Asia. So these three reasons that the U.S. interest in Central Asia revived after 2014. And the reason why I'm picking this year, 2014, is that it was seen in a lot of policy circles, given the U.S. planned drawdown in Afghanistan, that this was seen as an imminent pivotal moment, that the U.S. in particular would lose interest in this region. So what would happen after that? How would Central Asian governments engage with the U.S.? What would they have as kind of leverage or to interest the U.S.? And what would happen if the U.S. Completely lost interest or nearly completely lost interest and other powers in the region were to fill in some of that gap? But after 2014, or starting in 2013, Russia's activist foreign policy, we'll talk about that in a minute, China's growing economic influence, and the rise of ISIS in Afghanistan were all three moments that increased interest. Central Asia, I should say, has rarely been, if ever, a top priority in Washington. One good example of this is just a little over a year ago, the president of Uzbekistan, Islam Karimov, died in late August of 2016. And other than some initial questions about, is this going to lead to instability, there wasn't a lot of interest. There were other things that the caravan of foreign policy interests moved on to. And for somebody who has spent his entire career working on Uzbekistan and waiting for this moment when there was leadership succession after more than 25 years, I expected this, but I couldn't help but be a little bit disheartened. But I understand what goes on in Washington, and that there are a lot of priorities that draw their attention. So there are several events, as I alluded to, that changed the calculus after 2013. One was China's announcement of One Belt, One Road, or OBOR, or now it's subsequently been renamed to Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. Announced this in Astana, Kazakhstan in September of 2013. Russia annexed Crimea and fostered Ukrainian secessionism in March of 2014, and the Islamic State announced the creation of Islamic State in Khorasan province in January of 2015. So, and then fourth, President Xi and Putin in March of 2015 met and linked, at least rhetorically, the Belt and Road Initiative and the Russia-led Eurasian Economic Union. So these four events were all events that revived Washington's interest in the region just at a time when it seemed like it might just decline. So there's, I'm not sure this was that particular event, but this kind of thing, provokes some people in Washington. And then there was this interesting map that I found. This is a more sinocentric map of the world. And you could see, interestingly, that the U.S. is up there. You still have the same ocean. It's the same world, but it's just a different perspective that has been put out there in some new works. coming out of China. And then, of course, we've got this. I couldn't help, even though it's a little dated, I just enjoyed the looks on their faces, sort of suggesting where the relationship has gone. So what are the Central Asian states' relationships with these powers, and what is changing? Russia. Let's talk about Russia first. Russia has military bases in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. There is a long history of security service cooperation as a legacy of the Soviet period between the KGB inheritors of the security services in each of the Central Asian states. And then there's the growing Russian Central Asian state cooperation on Afghanistan, not in Afghanistan so much. But I should just temper this with the comments that the bases, while maintained, are not really growing. There's a lot of media attention that's offered out of the Russian press saying that they're sending more troops, they're going to increase the number of troops and personnel that they have stationed at bases in these countries. The security services, while still generally in close communications with one another, and they left over from the Soviet period, and that they train together, and Russia offers pensions to those who received training in the Soviet period. They're nonetheless hard-pressed to maintain such ties with younger generations. So we're talking about more than 25 years now, and we're in a new generation. There are a lot of people who came of age at the very end of the Soviet period and don't really remember, plus all the people who were born afterwards. The new president of Uzbekistan, Mirziyoyev, appears to be severing and replacing those security ties in order to undermine the old guard and consolidate power. So in Uzbekistan, the National Security Service really had a monopoly on power, second only to President Karimov until 2016. Now, in order to get out from under that, the new president needs to, is finding alternatives to the National Security Service, the former KGB. And so this is also would undermine the ties with Russia as he pushes more people into retirement. And they have less say. In Turkmenistan, President Berdimuhamedov already did this a long time ago. Those ties were severed. And in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, is now looking to China to diversify their training. And then, as far as cooperation on Afghanistan goes, the Central Asian regimes are suspicious of Moscow, but see some cooperation as necessary. But Tajikistan especially has regularly invoked sovereignty concerns. We'll talk about this concept of sovereignty a little bit later and how it's used in international relations as we think about rethinking relevance. Here's just a map of bases. It includes the Caucasus and Western former Soviet space. But here we have one base with more than one branch in Tajikistan, also in Kyrgyzstan, the Kant Air Base. So there's a presence there, but as I said, despite a lot of rhetoric, we need to look closely because it doesn't seem to be growing significantly. And then there's the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is China, Russia, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, all the Central Asian states except Turkmenistan, which has a regional anti-terrorism body within it that's based in Tashkent. there's not a lot to say about this. It's at the RATS, as it's known by its acronym. It's where the security services have representatives from each of those 6 countries based in Tashkent. I believe probably keeping an eye on each other than actually cooperating and sharing information. But this SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, can be seen now as China's multilateral entry ticket into Central Asia. And we'll see how China has built on that mostly in economic areas in a minute. I apologize for the datedness of this graph, but what you can see as of 2011, trade between China is rapidly catching up with Russia and has actually surpassed Russia with most of Central Asia. You can see from these charts exports and imports. On the imports, China has surpassed Russia. And actually, in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, overall the trade balance with Russia and China are about equal, but China is surpassing that. I want to talk about a few other economic and demographic related issues that are important here. One is the job market and migration patterns. If we look at this chart of the working age population in Central Asia, you'll see that for the next 25 years or so, the population in Central Asia is just going to go up, which means that unless the economies start to improve, and we don't see any signs of that, labor migrants are going to continue to seek other countries as destinations. And Russia is by far the largest destination for that, although we're starting to see some other countries, but it's still a very small percentage of the overall numbers. On remittances, you can see from this chart the result of the downturn in the economy, Russia's economy, economic crisis, as due to sanctions and fall in oil prices. The reason why it goes up and down, these are within the course of each year, is that most of the labor migration is seasonal, and so are the remittances, and most return to Central Asia for a few months in the winter before going back for most of the year to Russia. It drops significantly, but in the long run, we're going to see the numbers go back up, because that's what happens regardless of Russia's economy and the restrictions that the Russian government has placed on Central Asians. And then one more slide for this. You can see going back to 2007, and there was a drop back in here from this high point, but it rebounded and started to go up again until 2013, when the oil prices and sanctions were imposed, and the Russian value of the Russian ruble dropped. And it dropped significantly, in some cases by a third. These are remittances. The numbers of migrants has actually not dropped as much. It's just that they can't send back as much money. So just those are numbers. We're in thousands. We're talking about possibly as many as 10 million Central Asians who are working in Russia at the height. Tajikistan is the most remittance-dependent country in the world. Kyrgyzstan is number 2 or 3. Doesn't mean that they send the most, they get the most in sheer volume, but it means as a percentage of GDP, they're the most remittance-dependent. And just to underscore that further, Tajikistan has a population of about 8 million. 1 million of them are labor migrants. And I won't go into all the details of how you break down labor migrants into seasonal and more permanent and all of that. But suffice it to say that even with Russian restrictions on migrants showing up and having to register and pass exams, health exams, cultural history exams in Russia, for which they have to pay, that hasn't really slowed down, that itself hasn't slowed down the pace of migration. Just a quick note on another kind of migration, although this is a drop in the bucket, that Central Asian citizens have been joining the Islamic State and other militant groups in Syria and Iraq, although that's more or less coming to an end of late. But the Central Asian states have been more concerned with Afghanistan becoming less stable and that the instability is spilling across borders, especially to those that border on Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, especially, and then through them to other Central Asian states. Okay. Now, what are Russia's goals and challenges? We talked about some of them in the security sector. I want to talk about some additional ones in terms of short to medium-term goals. Russia, one is to maintain stability in Central Asia as a region. Instability could bring conflict and Islamist militancy closer to Russia. What that overlooks, however, is that a lot of the militants who went to Syria and Iraq and fought with not only Islamic State but with other groups were radicalized in Russia itself, where there's more access to internet and networks, and militant networks. The optics of not losing influence in its near abroad, this is part of the former Soviet Union in Central Asia, is important, and increasing trade and monopolizing military sales in the region or maintaining that is very important as well. But the challenges, there are also a lot of challenges, including accomplishing these objectives without spending a lot of resources on them. Russia does not have a lot of resources that it's willing to spend in Central Asia or in many other regions of the world as well. Demonstrating its regional relevance without causing instability sometimes are contradictory goals. So that's why they're not expending a lot more resources and not likely to engage militarily in the region. The Central Asian states are increasingly suspicious of Russian objectives, but also understand that this is a necessary relationship, and they rely on Russia for economic, as a destination for labor migrants. Now, China's goals and challenges. So with China, security in neighboring Western Chinese province of Xinjiang is important, and by extension, they want to maintain stability in the neighboring Central Asian states. Transportation infrastructure to facilitate exports to Europe, which means putting down roads and rail transportations across the former Soviet Union, across Eurasia, and getting buy-in from the Central Asian states as well as Russia to do that. And then accessing energy resources to fuel their economy in both from Russia as well as Central Asia, gas and oil from Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan. But there are a number of challenges as well. One is that pro-China investment, that the investment by Chinese state-owned enterprises has been dominated by state-owned enterprises as opposed to private enterprises, private businesses for the most part, and that this investment has brought Chinese money into Central Asia, buying Chinese materials with that money, building infrastructure with Chinese laborers. So this combination of investment and labor policies, which of course leaves infrastructure built in Central Asia. So it's not to say that they're not getting anything out of it. But the problem is that it doesn't build, it's not a recipe for sustainability. Who's going to be trained to maintain all of this infrastructure year after year? Extending their policy towards Xinjiang, a policy of development equals stability, is also a challenge because in many ways it's questionable how well it's worked in Xinjiang. There's been a lot of development, but a lot of the business that's been brought in has been benefited Chinese from the east, but not the Uyghur minority, 6 million Uyghur minority in Xinjiang. So concerns about instability, militancy and instability has continued. And then just in terms of the feasibility of putting down this infrastructure across Eurasia has its challenges as well, because if we look at the weights for imports and exports going into Central Asia, this is a slide and the next one thanks to Alexander Cooley, who put this together. You can see the number of days of time to import and time to export, which is huge when you look at compared to the rest of the world. So it's kind of a really striking, and that's due to a range of factors from bribery, a kind of toll gate mentality, bureaucracy, corruption. Okay, so let's talk about the militant goals and challenges quickly. Actually, I will skip this because I don't want to take up too much time. We can return to this, but I just want to summarize it by saying that it's important to distinguish between different kinds of Islamist groups in Afghanistan. The Taliban are focused largely on internal Afghan issues, not trying to export Islamist ideas beyond their borders, which means that if they were to capture the state, they wouldn't want to be antagonizing their neighbors to the north. But the Islamic State is another issue, and that's a question mark for a lot of people that continues to raise questions about security across the border to the north in Central Asia. But I should say here that where have Islamist militants actually succeeded in taking over a country or a territory where there hasn't already been a protracted conflict? Somalia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. So there's a lot of politics that's played to the north, both by Russia as well as the Central Asian governments for their own purposes, that in order to attract assistance and that kind of thing. We'll talk about that in a minute. That question whether it's really seen as a threat, or should be seen as a threat analytically. So the Central Asian states and the U.S. There is fairly limited trust in the U.S., not just trust in concerns about the U.S. fomenting color revolutions, but recent polling in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan have shown declining U.S. favorability. And Russia continues to be seen as the place where they need to look for security if the situation the stability were to decline. Although we saw in 2010, after the overthrow of President Bakiyev in Kyrgyzstan, when the provisional government in Kyrgyzstan asked for the Russian-dominated Collective Security Treaty Organization to come in and help Russia said no. So nevertheless, that's Russia is still seen as the stabilizing force. So what can we expect from the Central Asian states? So as I mentioned before, there's this exaggeration of threats from the south, partly to attract security assistance from all those willing donors. But it's also an approach to keep external powers engaged. By raising the alarm bells, it keeps the U.S. It maintains a discourse where that is as a justification for staying engaged in the region. Real challenges facing the regimes are internal. This is my own analysis. Unstable or uncertain leadership succession, although that wasn't the case in Uzbekistan. It was very stable, has been to date. We don't know what will happen in Kazakhstan or Turkmenistan. The leaders' extended families' business overreach and their expectations, especially in Tajikistan and Turkmenistan. This is a problem. As they push out other elites, it creates resentments, and it's unclear whether those other elites would seek to push back. And then there are vulnerable economies. The regimes are reliant on revenue control to fuel the patronage system, illicit trade, global commodity prices, and Russia's economy. And the mitigation options are limited as well. Consolidation of regime power seems to be the only model that they have embraced, and efforts to control external influences through economic or political means. So that's a very quick outline of a number of issues in terms of Central Asia's relationships with some of its neighbors, and the economic and political issues involved. I want to turn now quickly to why focus on great powers and the Central Asian states. Why do we do this? The colonial or post-colonial international relations frameworks often look at these kinds of questions about resources and demographic resources as well, such as the migrants, and then the locations of political and economic elites, and what are the sources of political, social, and economic authority. When I first gave a version of this talk a couple of years ago, I saw Russia and China as two of the three key reasons for renewed Central Asian relevance to the U.S. From the U.S. perspective, and the third was the rise of ISIS, as I've discussed. But this rather traditional colonialist approach to global interests still largely dominates in policy circles. The above are all important questions, some of which we've addressed in this talk. But isn't there more than geography, resources, and interstate relations in looking at this question? So I want to turn now to how do we rethink relevance in this context. So there's an ongoing debate in international relations and elsewhere between the future of the nation state and global governance. And the definitions are all over the map. Also, the relationship between capital flows and social well-being of populations. Who has access to securing their money abroad, in other places, tax havens, tax shelters, as well as offshore accounts of various kinds, and social well-being of populations. And I can't stress this is enough, but I'm looking for research. I'm not a researcher anymore because I'm working full-time at the State Department, but I want to put out this idea out there as a call for anyone who can find, develop methodologies for thinking about this connection between, especially between these two. And this is kind of the issue of politics of sovereignty, is sort of the the crux between these two. So is rising nationalism a reaction to what's going on here? And we have different kinds of studies out there, and these are some of the ones that I found of interest, but they don't paint the whole picture. So we have this, the first one on the left. I don't know if you can read it because of the dark illustration on the cover. Hannes Lacher, a German scholar, international relations scholar, who argues for international relations to account better for the changing relationships between territory and capital, and striving to strike a balance between globalists who argue institutions of global governance is replacing the nation state, and nation statists who argue that the nation state, that the nation state system's territorial consolidation of political power and capital is here to stay. So are nation states on the wane, or are they here to stay? Alexander Cooley and John Heathershaw's book that came out earlier this year as well, Dictators Without Borders, documents each of the elites in the Central Asian states, where they're putting their money, and arguing that they are in fact part of the global capitalist system, that Central Asia, we should not be looking at Central Asia as this sort of isolated place anymore between Russia and China. And then third, Carolyn Nordstrom, an anthropologist, Global Outlaws, where she documents cigarettes being sold one at a time on the streets in Angola by young boys. Where did those cigarettes come from? And she traces the whole chain all the way to international markets, and then also makes the point that what constitutes illicit or licit trade, smuggling, licit and illicit smugglers, is she really problematizes these categories as part of the international system. I just want to, there's a quote that I found particularly useful from Lacher's book, Beyond Globalization. He says, well, two. One is that capitalism is becoming increasingly globally integrated, though it remains enmeshed in national institutions, networks, cultures, and traditions. That seems kind of obvious. But then he says that globalists claim state sovereignty is undermined and increasingly supplanted by global institutions. But he says a better way to argue this, to state this, and here we have it, is sovereignty see it as being restructured to facilitate the global penetration of national economic spaces. Now, Cooley has argued that the elite use capital in ways that transcend state borders. And John Heathershaw, in a separate, other than in that book, has also argued that sovereignty is performed. He says that it's performed by national state actors, often within the context of development assistance, military support, and many other areas. And We also can see here that there's a whole host of, when we think about it, environment, human rights, illicit trade, intellectual property rights, ungoverned spaces, oceans, earth poles, outer space, are subject increasingly to extraterritorial global governance. And these are putting pressure on, if you think about it, the new states, of the now no longer entirely new states of the former Soviet Union, just as they've come into their own as nation states, they're feeling this pressure, or claiming to feel this pressure, of being undermined by the global governance. But are they, is the question. Are these treaties and structures of global governments merely weapons used by strong states against a weak? To what extent should we be thinking about states as discrete actors with particular interests versus the interests of elites, as Cooley has Art pointed out, and not only him. And then just as the nation-state system seemed to be settling into this period of post-imperial global stability, these vulnerabilities have begun to show. So I want to leave you with some final questions. There are many more than just these. But if Central Asian elites are fully globalized, then what does national sovereignty mean? In whose interests is sovereignty being upheld and protected and invoked? Are Central Asian states becoming outsourced policing or security administrations for greater powers? And to the extent that protectionist nationalism has gained traction elsewhere in the world in response to global economic inequity, tensions between capital flows and territoriality as well, how might it manifest itself in Central Asia? So let me stop there, and so we'll have enough time for a discussion. And again, this is as much or mostly an appeal to additional research that brings these issues of territoriality and capital to thinking about how new states, relatively new states like those in Central Asia, what role they're playing in the world. So, thank you.
You have 2 microphones.
I was just wondering, to what extent have any of these Central Asian countries tried to develop knowledge-based economies?
Sorry, what kind of economies?
Knowledge-based. In other words, something other than mineral extraction economies.
There's been talk about it, especially in Kazakhstan, and to some extent in Uzbekistan, but there hasn't been a lot of action. The talk is mostly using the language of diversification of resources and production. But in Kazakhstan, which has the most resources to do that, not unlike Russia, it's not happening. And one of the arguments for that is that the particular political economic system of elite control of resources, including in Russia, gets in the way of diversifying those resources, even developing further the energy resources that they already have by developing new technologies. So in some ways, they're turning to China to do that, or Japan, or the US in the Arctic, for example. But then you have other issues like political issues that get in the way, sanctions, or other countries private businesses, at least, if not the national ones, not wanting to do business with Russian or Central Asian companies because it's too difficult. In some areas it's worked out, but in most cases they are still they're the impediments of the Soviet legacy of controlled, centralized economies.
So I guess right now China and Russia are sort of working together, but do you think that there's any kind of competition as the Belt and Road Initiative grows? Is that going to bring China and Russia more into competition over Central Asia, and how is Central Asia going to respond, basically? It's a very broad question.
No, it's an excellent question. There are a lot of not unspoken or hidden obstacles to that relationship, but it's definitely a relationship of convenience. But like all relationships of convenience, there isn't a kind of ideological underpinning glue to hold it together in all the facets that are necessary. So that said, Russia is a secondary power in the world as much as it aspires to great power status. If you look at its population as a share of global population, if you look at its GDP as a share of global GDP, since from the end of the Soviet Union to now, it's just dropped precipitously. And there aren't signs of that turning around. They know that. China knows that. But it's useful for China as well because you need Russian and Eurasian cooperation to put this infrastructure development across so they can export goods to Europe. They can also export to European markets by sea, which is a lot cheaper. But it's clever to diversify and have contingency plans, and also it, for the reasons I pointed out about in the areas bordering on China, you get access to some resources, and there are also stability issues that they want to keep an eye on. But Russia wants Chinese investment, but on the other hand, they are worried about losing control. So what that's going to create, those tensions aren't going to go away. And as China, if Russia and the Central Asian states start becoming toll gates and raising tariffs for Chinese goods going across because they feel that that's the only way to maintain their own control, the question is, would China just turn away and just, okay, we'll go by sea? So, yeah.
Hey, I have 3 questions for you. Yeah. I probably have more than that, but I'll just give you 3. So one is, the talk is about between Russia and China, and you showed us maps.
Right.
And it's about relevance. If we're looking between Russia and China, what do we see? We see Mongolia. You haven't mentioned Mongolia.
Right.
It's right between them. And so what I'm wondering is, it's obviously not part of the same sort of story, but like, is that relevant somehow to your thinking about relevance? Like, why it is that you didn't talk about that? Is that a way of sort of coming through the back door to see like, well, what matters if we're going to talk about some places and not about others? You know, what's the dog that didn't bark here? And you know, why isn't the Mongol dog barking, given its sort of historical presence? Question number 2 is also about relevance, which is, you sort of said that you wanted to talk about relevance to whom, which is one way to sort of talk about it, and was largely seen from a Washington perspective. And you know, we here, thinking from a perspective of international studies, are all trying to make the case for what we do being relevant, right? And it often gets framed in these sorts of ways which are present focused, which look at security or look at resources. All those are the sorts of things that came into focus as you were sort of talking. But I was wondering, like, if you were to ask Central Asians, why are they relevant? There might be some of the same answers, but there also would be different ones too. And so I was trying to remember when I've been there what I've heard Central Asians talk about. And they tend to like numbers, ranking lists, and there's so many million Uzbeks, or like so many people speak this language, as opposed to where they rank on a world table. Or they would talk about the past, and they'd sort of like look at their presence in a world historical context or a world cultural context. Mm-hmm. And that'd be really kind of a central piece of their articulations from their own perspective of why they matter. Does that matter for us now? Like to take into cognizance the ways that they talk about it? Or should we keep these other sorts of points of views from the outside? And the third question is, you and I met each other back in the 1990s, right? And so we've had talks like this before, and I'm wondering how it would be different if this talk were being given in 1991. Because some of it would be kind of similar. I mean, you sort of think about the end of the Soviet Union, the place of Central Asia, why is it relevant, why does it matter relative to Russia? The place of Islam was kind of hotly debated at the time too. The Tajik Civil War was just kind of getting underway. Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia were all sort of, talked about as like possible directions for Central Asia to go. It seems to me that the big difference is China. Like, that's the crucial thing. And so China would not have been a central player there at that point. And so I guess the question is, like, how much does it matter that China is the sort of driving factor here? Now, China's not a second-tier world power. The Economist, whatever week it was, like within the last month, had a picture of President Xi on the cover saying, like, the most powerful man in the world or something. And so as an historian, it makes me sort of think the deeper histories about, China and where it's present and where it's not present in the Central Asian past. In the 17th century, the sort of arguments about China used to care about like sending things across Central Asia to get to Europe, and then the Indian Ocean trade route sort of like took their sort of focus elsewhere, and Scott Levi talks about that in other ways. But that echo came back to me looking at your graph about customs duties, right? And the delays and the obstacles from a Chinese perspective, right? In sort of encountering Central Asia. Why bother with Central Asia in a way when you've got Africa, when you've got all these other places where the Chinese story is coming into focus? Mm-hmm. And given that China does not, in the modern period, have the same kinds of interactions that, say, Russia has had with Central Asia, does that have implications for the continuing centrality of Central Asia from the Chinese perspective? And could it be an echo of that kind of earlier, like, reorientation of the Chinese story, which then takes Central Asia back into a less central location?
You dropped your scarf. Oh. Great set of questions. Let me work backwards. And India is not far behind, but in 20 years or 10, 20, 30 years, we would be having this conversation, including India as well, probably. I love the historical perspective on this. If we had this conversation in 1991, I agree with you. China was not part of, but Islamist activity, nationalism was talked about, and then that went away in Central Asia. It's actually starting to come back a little bit in the last few years, in places like Kyrgyzstan, but not only with protests in Kazakhstan over land being rented for 50 years or a long period to China to develop, and Tajikistan as well. So there's, I was approaching this from a lot of issues that dynamics that I see going on in the West, and trying to sort of link it up with what I haven't quite seen yet happening in the former Soviet Union, or it's in Central Asia, and why not? So I'm not going to pretend to be able to address that in this talk, but it's something I want to, I'm going to continue to think about. So I'm not sure if your last point was a question, other than, if we're giving this talk in '91, that was just a rhetorical point, right? Or did you have a question embedded in there?
Yeah, but it was about the implications of it being about China. If you accept the premise of what I'm saying,
Yeah,
China,
right.
what that meant for the future of Central Asia.
I don't think Central Asia is that important to China. I outlined what I think are the issues that they're concerned with, but in terms of global expansion, and I don't think Russia is that important to China either. They're making gestures because it's expedient in some ways, and Russia wants to be heard, and but wants a growl to be heard. But I think that's going to be a growing issue, and but as China moves into Central Asia, not only economically, but followed up by security concerns to protect those interests as well as elsewhere in the world. Just a couple of years ago, or a year and a half ago, China started a quadrilateral security agreement with Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Tajikistan. It was the first multilateral body that involved a former Soviet state in Central Asia, in China, that did not also include Russia. They didn't squeal. Russia did not complain about that. So it's interesting that because they had other priorities, they did not want to rock the relationship with China, because they needed China as a partner in, given sanctions and Western pressure. As far as the second question about relevance, why do Central Asians think they're different? And I agree with your points about focusing on the past. Which Central Asians also? When you have 6 to 10 million who are living in Russia, now they're going back and forth, but you've got more than a generation's worth of largely Tajiks, but not only, who have received Russian citizenship. According to one Russian research institute, there are 350,000 Tajiks out of a population of 8 million who have dual citizenship and hold Russian passports. It doesn't mean that Central Asia is being brought back into Russia's orbit. They don't, linguistically, yes, when you have people going and spending so much time in Russia working, yes, they're going to maintain use of the Russian language. On the other hand, many of them are sort of ghettoized in work units where they're not learning Russian the way they learned it in the Soviet period. So they can get around on the streets, but it's a different way of thinking. This is a very pragmatic approach to work in Russia. We need to do this. It's still better than staying at home. So I think the focus on the past, I'm not doing field work among labor migrants. There are other people who are doing that. I don't know how many of them, what kind of discourse about the past is going on. I know I've heard a lot of the research is revealing what they're saying about the present there. So that's a whole research area that would be interesting. I'm sure they're talking about it. You don't just abandon it. But that would also be maybe an entree into thinking about linking it up with questions of nationalism, issues that we're seeing in the West. As people talk about make X country great again, or the way it used to be when we had clear borders and protectors of those borders who have our back and are protecting our interests. So I don't hear that talk. I mean, I'm not doing field work there now, but if the question would be, are Central Asians talking about their past, the Soviet Union, perhaps, and that's something that the governments are not happy about. In Uzbekistan, under Karimov, he would do everything to start eliminating all these symbols of the Soviet period, and famous Uzbeks who participated, removing their statues. So there's an interesting convergence there with having dual Russian citizenship. How do Central Asians, migrants, and their families think about what if Russia were to come back and we would join Russia, because that would make our lives a lot easier, so we wouldn't have to take these stupid exams and pay bribes and cross borders. But I mean, that's not likely to happen. So I'm talking around your question. I'm not sure how to answer it, but it's provoked a lot of interesting ideas. As far as Mongolia, somebody actually raised Mongolia a few days ago, and my answer was I haven't had time to focus on Mongolia yet. So I'm going to punt that one. Other questions? Yes, please.
I just have a quick question.
Here's the mic for you.
Sorry. Yeah. How do any of these, whether it be Russia or any of the Central Asian states, how do they, you say relevance, how do they move forward if the only thing that's happening today is the elites are taking the capital of the country and moving it offshore?
So who's moving them forward, right? I mean, as
how do you invest in a country if all your capital is being taken by a few people? And
so are we talking about how might American or Chinese or Russians invest there, or how would Central Asians invest in their own countries? I'm saying that because I've raised this question about where is the nation state today, and when you have the elites, many elites who are moving their capital offshore or hiding it away, who are they representing? And in whose interest, who is there to embrace this idea of a Tajikistan that's going to move forward? It's a question, and in whose interest is it for Tajikistan or Uzbekistan to move forward? I mean, this is you're asking like the key question that the policy community, the international development has focused on for years. But I'm just wondering, I'm just maybe being provocative here. What are we trying to move forward within the framework of the nation state? It's being, in many ways, it's being undermined. So, I don't have an answer for that, but I'm trying to sort of deconstruct this idea of this national whole. I mean, I won't go into the U.S. Dynamics today, but those questions are being raised as well about who's
right.
Yeah.
So I have a question that is kind of outside of the purview of this talk, but so you can take it or leave it.
Okay.
You can punt if you want. So it's really about Syria and Russia. What do you see as Russia's goal in Syria and with Assad, and by extension maybe Iran as well? So yeah, that's basically it.
So not only is it outside the purview of the talk, it's also outside of any purview that I've really focused on at work, because I'm now doing Russian foreign policy towards Asia. I can talk about Russia's global interests. I've touched on some of that already, and you can draw some conclusions about what's going on in Syria. I think since Putin became president this time around, there have been a number of cases of adventurism in Crimea and in eastern Ukraine, and then Syria. Very different situations. But I think to summarize it, Russia does not have a lot of options right now. They haven't diversified their economy. The oil prices have not risen significantly. They're no longer have the economic resources that they once had. So, and yet there's a presidential election coming up in March, and while I think nobody has any doubts that Putin is going to win, he can't take any risks between now and then, or any new risks than dealing with what already exists. So I think they're waiting for opportunities to arise around the world to seize, if they see that it would help project Russia into a larger role, propel Russia into a greater power role, and the recognition for that, because that would then allow Putin to show to domestic audiences, but particularly the economic and political elites, that he still has something to offer Russia for the next 6 years, starting in March. Otherwise, the succession struggle will kick into action, whatever that means domestically. So Syria is part of that, but it's not helping him at home, I believe. North Korea and Afghanistan, in Asia, two areas that I look at more regularly at work, are opportunities. But what does Russia have to offer in the North Korea situation? So staying close to China politically, but still dragging their heels on anything that would lead to growing U.S. footprint in the Korean Peninsula, which they wouldn't want. And they don't want North Korea with nuclear weapons either, but yeah. Anyone? Oh, we have a question here. Let me.
The order doesn't matter to me.
Well, why don't you go first, since you haven't gone yet?
Yeah, so my question goes back to the small portion of your talk where you talked about the intersection between labor migrants and the issue of radicalization. And, so there's a lot of research, NOAA's research, showing that, what recruits there are that are then going to Syria and Iraq, many of those are coming out of, these labor migrant communities for a number of reasons, including the internet, like you mentioned, and other sorts of informal networks that they're getting there. So, I'm aware of the variety of tools that Central Asian states are using, both repressive and otherwise, sort of looking ahead about the potential return of some of these fighters as we see sort of morale among ISIS recruits going down and people returning home. what I'm less familiar with is sort of the measures that Russia is taking, how they're treating the labor migrant community in thinking about this issue of, again, labor migrants being sort of a vector for radicalization. What's going to happen when these labor migrants come home? So my question is sort of twofold. One, this idea of people returning being a threat, do you think that it's overblown? That's my first question. And two, what does the Russian state think about that? And what is the Russian state doing either independently with labor migrant communities or in cooperation with, Central Asian states?
Okay, thanks. I think that the returnee question is overblown for the Central Asian states because there's not a lot of room for them to come back and do anything. And I think about this as there are three levels. There's certainly no tolerance for this at the state level. There's no tolerance, there's no interest in this among local level elites in places where there isn't as much centralized control, in Tajikistan, because they'd rather deal with the devil they know in Dushanbe, the Rahman government, than militants from outside that might bring, all kinds of thunder and lightning on them from all kinds of places and around the world, not just Dushanbe. And it's not supported by the population at large. As much as there might be there's lots of frustration and anger, people are voting with their feet and going abroad, but they don't want militants coming in and living among them and causing problems. So there's no room anywhere in Central Asia for any kind of existential threat to take hold. So I'm not worried about that. And I think it's overblown for the reasons that I said before about, keeping other countries engaged and bringing in security assistance. They're not going to get much economic investment, so that's the other side, the other thing they want, but the security assistance they're hoping to get, but there are a lot of limits on that, at least in Washington, if not in Moscow and Beijing. As far as what is Russia doing about it, I think the returnee issue is much more likely to bite them than it is Central Asia. And I think they're paying more attention to it now. But they were saying, I don't know what they believed or who believed it, but they were saying that Central Asians are radicalized in Afghanistan, somewhere in the south, and then they're going off to Syria and Iraq through Russia. It's hard to study this, but there seems to be a fair amount of consensus that the radicalization, as you also pointed out, is in Russia for the reasons you mentioned. So Russia is starting to look at this more, and there have been more Central Asians involved in more terrorist attacks in Europe and Russia. So that's of concern to them. They have collaborated with some of the security services, Uzbek, Tajik, with allowing security service people to come to Moscow or wherever and kidnap some Tajik and bring them back to Tajikistan. They don't regularly say, if you want this guy, you can have him. There's no clear smooth extradition process, because that's also a political game. It's like, we want to keep some of these people that you don't like in Russia what are you going to give us to get them back? So there's a lot of that going on. But Russia is also outsourced, and I think this is still going on. Russia's outsourced monitoring, surveillance of Central Asian communities in Russia to the Central Asian security services. Occasionally they can come into a prison and interrogate somebody. They also, especially Uzbekistan, which has a much extensive network, much more extensive network, monitoring, having spies in every community to report back. And if somebody comes home, then they'll be interviewed, interrogated once they get back home. There are hardly any Turkmen, relatively speaking, in Russia, so we're not talking about them. More of them are in Turkey. So there's this outsourcing going on, but I think they're starting to look more closely, but we're talking about millions of people. On the other hand, I mean, from the way they look at it, how are they going to monitor millions of people, even though a tiny fraction of these are actually engaging in militant activity somewhere else in the world. Tiny. I mean, we're talking about a few thousand out of, several million. So I don't know how they're going to manage that, but there are starting to be more contracts within the former Soviet space between Russia and the government, Central Asian governments, the way there have been contracts for years between the Philippines and India and Bangladesh with the Gulf states in terms of sending labor migrants. Any final questions? Are we out? We have time, yeah.
Okay. So I wanted to ask another question about China, really, also from a history kind of point of view. And it basically is a question like, what's the mutual level of knowledge and understanding across that border? And that's, how do Central Asians, how much do they understand China? And does China care about that? And if so, what are they doing about it? And it's a historic question because you talked correctly, I think, about this sort of level of suspicion of outsiders, right, within Central Asia, which is largely a story of the colonial period, meaning suspicion oriented towards Russia, maybe some deep stuff towards Britain, and there are other things too, but it's largely a Russian story. And yet most of the kind of cross-border things you're describing here are about labor migrations into Russia and people who know Russian language and have educational interactions. And these worlds know each other in a kind of deep way, although there's a legacy of suspicion on the outside. On the other hand, you don't see the sort of labor migration into China for reason. I mean, there's a reason for that. And also, the extent to which Chinese language is being known. Can you say something about what's happening within Central Asia now to kind of look across that border, and how far is that actually creating understanding that kind of works alongside this legacy?
Right. So my sense is that there's not a lot of understanding in Russia or in Central Asia of China. As I said, a lot of the workers in Central Asia and working on Chinese projects are coming from China and going back to China, although some of them are intermarrying in Tajikistan and that kind of thing. So there's not, but anecdotally and in very, very small numbers, there are more Central Asians who are going to study in China and get trained to start to manage some of these projects in Central Asia, the Chinese finance projects. I think ultimately, I mean, you're looking at time, history, right? So 30 years from now, when the Chinese population starts to decline in age due to, continuation, by individual choice, family choice of the one-child policy that's been going on for 2 generations, we might see a need for labor migration there. It doesn't, as you point out, there's not a need for it right now. Russia's population is not showing any signs of turning around and growing. So I don't know what is, if they both, I mean, if things don't change that much in Central Asia in the next 30 years, and suddenly we have 2 giant destinations of labor migration, does that just maintain a status quo in Central Asia, does that alone do it? I don't know. I'm not economic demographer or whatever it takes to understand that. I think Chinese projects are also learning more about how to engage, what's the term? Do crisis management in projects around the world as they get burned in certain places, like in Myanmar and elsewhere, by resentful populations, and in Kazakhstan, and there was an attack on the Chinese embassy in Bishkek, although that's not necessarily labor related. But so I don't see a lot of education across that border. I think there have been traders. There are Central Asians who are based in Urumqi and have done business, but it's hard to compete with a lot of Chinese-run importing projects. So I think we're out of time, right? All right. Well, thank you all for coming.